As I'm seated with my guest, Christopher Lasch, distinguished professor of history at University of Rochester, but more than that, one of the most perceptive of our cultural historians, I suppose best known for his most recent book, The Culture of Narcissism, and more about that as we talk. He's in town under the auspices of the Illinois Humanities Council, and the subject is a subject in the minds of everybody, parent or not, education and excellence in education. Excellence, I notice, in quotes, old refrain, new departure. And I suppose your thoughts, your recent paper on education, which I think is probably reflects on your forthcoming book, Minimum Self. Survival, a psychic survival in troubled times.
Yes.
Coming out. I imagine this paper touches on what will be
Yes, there's some overlap.
I'm thinking, we hear the phrase. It comes from the White House, too, from the President's Commission.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic to hear so much enthusiasm for educational excellence coming from these quarters. But,
so we have to ask the question is, what is education? What is an educated, or who is an educated person?
Well, I think that's a question that's become harder and harder to answer because we've largely, I think, forgotten what education is all about and therefore what an educated person is. I mean, the current definition, I suppose, is somebody who does well on certain tests and has good scores and progresses through the grades at the right, in the right order, and winds up with a good job.
Another thing, I know in your paper and in your book and all of them, you speak of this. In recent times, ever since Sputnik, when the Russians went up there, the emphasis always has been, by God, technologically, technologically, engineers.
That's right.
Hey, we got to keep up with them.
Yeah, that's this talk about excellence is very familiar because that was the refrain, 25 years ago, in the wake of the Sputnik business, when everybody concluded that we were falling behind the Russians in space research and military research. Now, what's provoked the current outcry about mediocrity is the fear that this country is falling behind West Germany and Japan in the race for world markets, and that somehow the school system has to correct whatever's wrong with.
Isn't there a wonderful irony to the cycle? A former ally appeared to have surpassed us technologically with Sputnik, and now two former enemies appear to have surpassed us commercially. And so therefore it's the technology and the commerce that appear to be the two sine qua non of an education.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And given the background, it's perfectly predictable, I think, that the kinds of reforms that we hear being advocated are very superficial. Lengthening the school day, the school year, maybe paying teachers a little more. What are some of the other proposals?
Merit pay.
Merit pay, yes, right.
But more tougher rules, more discipline, of course.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But now we come to what so we're talking about a technocratic education. We're talking about technocracy. And what does that envision? What sort of society does that envision?
Well, it envisions a society where, I think, decisions are made by a technical elite of specialists and experts, and the rest of the population is expected to acknowledge the superior expertise of these people and to go along to accept decisions more or less passively, and in which the extent of their participation in the political process is confined to a vote, if that. I think that it's interesting that and scary too, that for a long time political scientists and political theorists have actually been arguing that, well, democracy may work best when a lot of people don't vote, and there's no reason to get exercised about the high level of non-participation, even at that level, since most people have don't have access to the kind of technical expertise that is allegedly necessary in order to arrive at enlightened decisions on public policy.
You know, it's a phrase that was used by a Harvard man, Sam Huntington, during the Vietnam War. He spoke of democratic distemper.
That's right, exactly. As if as if whatever was wrong with our system was an excess of democracy. Too many people claiming to know how to run things.
Now that's it. Too many people claiming how to. So leave it to us, the experts.
Yes,
as we did, of course, in Vietnam. But leave it to us, the experts in matters economic. And
yes.
So that which is called excellence in education, that to combine what they call the rising tide of mediocrity, which they really mean is the rising tide of a democratic impulse, I suppose.
Yes, I think so. It's also, I think, significant that there's been, if you compare the current debates about excellence in education with the debates that took place in the 50s, when the school system was under attack from the same kind of people for the same kinds of reasons, and the debates absolutely the same, I think, except in one particular. It's slightly less candid. In the late 50s, reformers like Admiral Rickover, do you remember his crusade for excellence, were more candid in demanding a dual system of education, one for technical elites and one for everybody else. Now, I think that that's, in effect, what's being advocated today by the National Commission on Excellence and all the other commissions that issued high-powered reports last year, but without saying so.
What was in Rickover's favor, as you point out, was he was frank about it.
Yes.
He says, this is it. That'd be two classes, an upper and lower class, and the upper few who determine things and the lower passive who accept.
Yeah.
But now it's said, but there's a dissemblance involved.
Yes, there's still a cover of democratic rhetoric.
You point out something quite horrendous and in the air. The Bureau of Labor Statistics points out, we're told, there'll be more and more people employed, as in with cybernetics or computer programmers and more. Something else seems to be in the air.
Yeah, I think that's really an awful swindle. All this talk about the growing demand for experts, for computer people, computer programmers, computer operators, and of course the push for computer literacy in the schools is being justified on the grounds that there's a huge opening job market for such people. But the statistics that are issued by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and which ought to be widely known since they've been reported in many different sources, show, I think, conclusively that nothing of the kind is happening, that while there will be undeniably an increasing number of technical jobs, the number of unskilled jobs, menial jobs, is increasing at a far greater rate, and that there will be a much greater need, for example, for janitors and fast food operators.
Janitors, nurses' aides, sales clerks, cashiers, and waiters and waitresses. And far more will be needed than those in what may be slightly sophisticated work.
Yes, that's true. That point needs to be qualified in its own right. The jobs that are being presented as if they demanded high levels of technical skills are actually, in their own way, almost menial. For example, computer programming is very rapidly being reduced to a routine, like all other industrial routines, which demands a very medium level of technical skill.
You point out, this is in the paper of Christopher Lasch before the Illinois Humanities Council, and in the paper you point out these trends, the trends now that seem to be further accentuated, continue. The occupational structure of the United States will consist of three classes. One, a small professional, managerial, decision-making elite. Two, the group you just described, a somewhat larger class of professional workers performing tasks reduced to a routine.
One might even mention public school teaching in that latter category, since the whole development of the profession, I think, over the last 50 years or more, has been to try and concentrate more and more the responsibility for educational decision-making, policy-making, in an administrative bureaucracy, leaving the actual teacher with as little discretion as possible, on the theory that the ordinary teacher can't be trusted.
So she, too, this ordinary teacher can't be trusted, becomes something of a passive figure, as well as the students, of course.
Yes, that seems to be at least the ideal.
And the third, the largest class, unskilled workers, mostly non-unionized, and that's an interesting trend today.
Yes.
Or an incredible precedent-shattering, union-busting climate. A non-unionized, ill-paid to perform menial labor, though not necessarily back-breaking. That's interesting. So the impression is, hey, this is sweet. The smiling little boys and girls working at the fast food joints.
Yes, that's right. One reason these trends are concealed, I think, or tend to be not noticed, is that we cling to the distinction between blue-collar and white-collar work. And we tend to assume that white-collar work necessarily demands a higher level of technical competence and skill, whereas, in fact, the so-called white-collar sector is undergoing the same process of de-skilling.
You also point out in another paper, and I'm sure this is in that book I'm looking forward to reading, as are many, Minimal Self, that as a moment something's happening to us, with all the dissemblance taking place and the smiles and the geniality, that and the acceptance of our own impotence of the great many will be liked. That people will sort of finally get to like it.
Yes.
Knowing no other course, no alternative.
Yeah. The phrase that comes to mind is the phrase that Betty Friedan used when she spoke of the middle-class household back in the early 60s, the comfortable concentration camp.
Yeah. So education, the excellence they're talking about, then is something highly technocratic.
Yeah, it would seem to me that it is. Even though, as I say, it's presented as a program of education for everybody.
We're coming to what is an educated person and what is a society supposed to be, too. About awareness and participation in the community. So, and to what it has been from antiquity on, education, as we know. I think a good way might be, after this pause, this message, a good might be to hear a voice, an unexpected kind of voice, and her thoughts about education. That's a good takeoff point for my guest, Christopher Lasch. Christopher Lasch, for those of you who may have tuned in late, is, I find, one of the most incisive of cultural historians in this country. And you may recall his book, The Culture of Narcissism, and the forthcoming one is called Minimal Self. I like that subtitle, Psychic Survival in Troubled Times. In a moment, after this message, we resume. So resuming, with Christopher, we've got to drop this other shoe as to what education is as you have seen it all your life and the lives long before yours. This is a woman, a black woman, in a housing project about 10 years ago, and we're talking about her life, and then she points to her little grandchild, about a year old, 18 months old, with her daughter, and then I ask her, well, what would you like to see for him? And she answers in this manner.
Oh, boy, you know what? The only thrill now for me is to see my grandchild come and see what I can do about this. Won't that be fun? Trying to teach him to paint. I don't want to really make him, but I hope I'll be able to afford, like, the things that will give him incentive to create painting, music, literature, all these things that can free his little soul, and he can just go on and do the things he would like to do. And I'd like to make enough money to do that. Help him do it.
And that's what I want out of life, is her education so he could paint, music, literature, to free his little soul.
Her ideas about education are clearly hopelessly retrograde. She doesn't understand that the purpose of education is to turn out specialists who are comfortable in the new world of technology, computers.
But isn't this what she said? Isn't this what education was supposed to be?
Is it all about? Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You talked about this, but what is an aware person, an educated, a political person? Education is the road to that.
Well, I think that one reason we have so much trouble with this issue, so much trouble remembering what an education is, and have to listen to somebody like that rather than specialists and professors of education in order to be reminded what it is that our school system was founded originally at a time when people still retained some memory of the connection between education and politics, education and citizenship, and had some notion of citizenship itself as an educative process, as something that brings out people's capacities and encourages good judgment, discrimination, the ability to talk and think. Even in the 19th century already, the relationship between citizenship and education had come to be viewed almost in reverse. Education came to be seen as a means of training so-called good citizens, which often meant training people with reflexive, patriotic responses.
Now, I think because I know your father-in-law, Henry Steele Commager, the distinguished American historian, always speaks, of a town hall idea at beginnings. That involved talk and knowledge and persuading and arguing.
That's right. We thought that what democracy was all about was popular decision-making, democratic decision-making, in which everybody's talents would be indispensable. What we now have is a system in which most people's talents are regarded as, irrelevant, as not worth bringing out, not worth educating, because important decisions it's taken for granted ought to be made by experts.
I'm thinking of this woman whose voice we heard. She says she wants her grandchild some painting to create, she said. And yet we see many TV commercials, there's a surfeiting of TV commercials aimed mostly at ghetto kids, but others. If you get that education, you can do it's a lie to begin with, but even for it's true, you can make it in this world, meaning in business, and you get up that ladder as though that were the purpose of education.
Yes. Instead of bringing out one's qualities, talents,
that she was
character.
Talking about.
Yeah.
Well, one of these subjects, we know that schools today have emphasis. We know there's been a tremendous increase in the enrollment of schools in business administration and in engineering. But there's been sort of decline in what we call the humanities. Now, humanities and humanity, are related, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're probably very closely related. But humanities are not the way to a job in our society. I think that, just to be quite clear about it, that what's wrong with our educational system is simply that our society does not, in fact, need very many educated people. And those whom it does needs, it needs to be educated only in the most narrow and technical sense. So it's not surprising that the school system is a mess, or that the humanities in particular are not highly regarded. It's a society that is still verbally committed to the principle of universal education, but has really lost any practical interest.
See, what this woman in this housing project was talking about for her grandchild, she was talking about the humanities.
Yeah, notice that she's not talking about vocational education. She has no interest
to free his little soul.
Yeah, that's
painting,
right.
literature, music is what she said.
You couldn't ask for a better description.
So what she is really saying, this woman, it seems to me, unless I'm reading too much, she's expressing something a great many millions may feel,
Yes.
though are inchoate about
Yes,
it,
yes.
are unable to express.
Yes.
And that's what's being buried.
Yes, that's right. I agree.
You point out in one of your conversations that one of the things missing, and this is one of my favorite horrors, that's we have no sense of history. Not only is history, you're a historian, you're Henry Steele Commager, a historian. Those who teach us most about what it was like to what it is now are historians. Yet there's a de-emphasis on that or a neglect of it.
Yes. Yeah, that too, I think, is something that our society believes that it can do without on the whole. It just doesn't really see much point in any interest in the past. Partly because it deludes itself that the past can easily be forgotten, that things progress at such a rate that the past quickly becomes irrelevant. In fact, it usually comes back to haunt you.
The old Santayana truism.
Yes.
Because you point out here, that's all we have to draw on. The past represents a fund of collective experience that can be looked to partly as a standard by which to measure current realities and source of. So we know that's forgotten. We know that recently politicians always say to us, forget about Vietnam.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it never happened.
Mm-hmm.
So if it never happened, there's no lesson to be learned.
Yeah, those are painful memories that should be put behind us as quickly as possible.
And therefore, if there's no past, what's ahead of us? I'm thinking about the paper and the forthcoming. So what we're talking about, really, when they speak of excellence, they're talking about a high-grade vocational school.
Yes, that's right.
That's what it really is.
That's what it comes down to, I think, yes. Yeah, with, I suppose, low-grade vocational training for the people who obviously aren't destined for upper reaches.
Wasn't there once a society, in which the great many were helots, in which the great many did, or is this a society we envision? It seems to me in the last part of the 20th century, instead of these incredible horizons that are possible, to span, we're going back to something almost Neolithic.
Yeah, I think there are some very disturbing indications that something like that is happening. If you put together two trends, for example, the de-skilling of the workforce, the increasing reliance on unskilled labor, and part-time labor at that, and a process that could be described as one of depoliticization, the tendency to regard popular participation decision-making as an encumbrance and a nuisance at best. Those are disturbing signs, I think.
Just as you said that, I came across this passage from your comments, from Rick, pointing about Rickover's comments 30 years ago, saying pretty much what the Commission is saying today, only more honest about it.
Yeah.
From Rickover's point of view, one that was shared by many intellectuals later associated with the New Frontier, including Kennedy himself. The challenges facing a technological society were far too complicated for people without technical training. The man of the future, whom we depend, Rickover declared, is the technical expert. And so this is when, I'll decide for you. That's what it's about. I'll decide for you.
Yes.
Now, are issues that complex for an ordinary person when it comes to...
Well, issues of war and peace, for example, issues of nuclear policy. And there's a very, very similar line of commentary emerging recently about disarmament. The advice, I think, that is being given from people in positions of responsibility and authority is that disarmament is a good example of a highly technical issue that cannot be entrusted to popular debate, which is only muddied by popular discussion, the ins and outs of which cannot be understood except by, in fact, specialists in what's known as arms control. But you could name just about any other issue, which is, in fact, many of which are seem fairly straightforward to me.
And I think the average person, if they let them alone, we know. So you have the experts speaking in technical terms and jargon, and we lose track as they're talking. One debates the other, disputes it. Yet, if we have enough missiles to knock them off 50 times, and they have enough missiles to knock us off 50 times, why the 51st?
Yes.
So that's not too complicated.
It would not seem to be. But even if it were, it strikes me that the assumption that therefore such issues are accessible only to a trained elite is pernicious again.
Yeah.
What's to prevent the public from being educated or from educating itself in the complexities of these issues, if there are genuine complexities? And it would seem to me that, again, an older idea of citizenship would not assume that because issues may be complex, and I'm willing to concede that any major political decision does have a range of complexity and ambiguity, which is probably inherent in the fact that you can't predict precisely what's going to happen. An older notion of citizenship would not have jumped to the conclusion that therefore popular participation should be kept at a minimum.
This is what the town meeting was about.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, town meetings didn't deliberately exclude questions that had any hint of complexity.
See, I've marked exclamation points here. Read part of Christopher Lasch's paper, but in our society, there's no greater need for well-informed citizens than it has for highly skilled workers. This is the theme of those speaking of excellence in education. What it really needs is a passive electorate willing to be led by policy-making elite. And then they speak of the increasing complexities of things of the world today, whereas it need not be, nor is it, when you get right down to it.
Yeah.
But if it's increasingly complex, then the person who has made the helot really said, the great many, that is, says, well, they know more than... Isn't that what's always said during the worst times of the Vietnam War? Listen, they know more than we do. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be where they are.
Yes. Yes. Speaking of Vietnam, it's really remarkable that these platitudes about the need for experts can still carry any plausibility. That's exactly what happened in this. Rickover's the thing you read, that kind of language was echoed over and over by Kennedy himself, who said repeatedly that, well, in our world, political decisions, unlike the simple days of the 19th century, are highly complex and so on. Well, American foreign policy was based on those assumptions. So McNamara's whiz kids who were schooled in games theory and had studied under masters like Herman Kahn with his theory of escalation, finely calibrated, and look what happened. A little common sense would have been much more useful.
Kit, you just said something. Those who you think would be discredited are still looked upon as the pundits by the media. I suppose a classic case would be Henry Kissinger. Yes. Seymour Hersh just did a book that is devastating, that it cites chapter and verse, wholly discrediting, man. So did Willie Shawcross with the Sideshow, the destruction of Cambodia under Nixon and Kissinger. And yet, unscathed. On the contrary, just highly respected, and he offers words slowly and with a great deal of authority.
Yeah, it's really remarkable and very disturbing. Apparently, the trappings of authority, of expertise, are so imposing that no one bothers to look at the content of people's actual demonstrated public incompetence.
You just hit it. So the substance is ignored since he is, we come to the image again, he is an expert. And you look at the track record, it's horrendous, but he's an expert. So who needs an education, educated in the olden sense? Reading from Christopher Lasch's paper. Since the citizen has by now been reduced to a consumer, one needs to recognize the political brand names as you do names on, I suppose, names of canned goods too.
Yes.
That's a brand name. It's a political. He's the brand name expert too.
Yes,
Expert,
that's right. That's one of the
expert in Vietnam, or whoever you want to name. So and so, Herb Stein, expert on economics.
Yes, right.
Or Cap
example.
the Knife, expert on military. So these are brand names.
Yes, yeah. Economics is a fine example of a subject which has been presented to people as if it were so arcane and so difficult, complex, that nobody but a certified economist can.
Well, we got it after this. I know what I want to ask you. There are two things I want to ask you. But after this pause, naturally the question is dropping the shoe. You, Christopher Lasch, and your thoughts, idea, what's to be done? As Dee says to Gogo, waiting for Godot, what's to be done? And so I'll ask you this after this message. We're resuming with Christopher Lasch. So we see what they, the experts, mean, or the commission, the President's Commission Education, mean by excellence. What's to be done? What do you see as a way out?
Well, I guess if I'm correct in my contention that the underlying cause of educational failure has a lot to do with our society in general, then I think ultimately the answers don't lie in the field of education. We tend to assume that educational reform is the key to everything else, and I don't think it is. A society that can't find better use for people's talents will not develop anything much in the way of an educational system. So in the long run, the thing is to change our priorities and our notion of what constitutes useful work, our idea of what constitutes citizenship, and to revive some real notion of those things. But that doesn't mean that there aren't more immediate things that can be done. I think that the woman that we were talking about earlier is representative of an awful lot of people who just have the strong feeling, with very good reason, that their children are being shortchanged by the school system. I think that part of the problem is that, like all other institutions, this one bears the heavy hand of sort of unregulated, unchecked professional expertise. In this case, the education industry, the schools of education, the educational bureaucracy. The first thing, it seems to me, that needs to be done is to restore some autonomy to the teacher, and that in itself, I think, would go a long way toward improving things. I think there's a kind of circular and self-perpetuating process that is characteristic of bureaucracies in general. People at the top feel that they can't trust their subordinates, in this case school administrators, feel that the teacher is incompetent, essentially, and therefore not to be trusted. And that tends to become a self-validating prophecy. Eventually, the subordinates do become incompetent because they're never allowed to exercise any competence, so that a teacher who's simply expected to teach out of a textbook and to observe standard and highly rigidified procedures is naturally not likely to exert much initiative and doesn't, in fact, need to be trained in a subject, needs more to be trained in the ins and outs of educationese, to master a certain kind of jargon, which is what, 9/10 of the training in schools of education seems to be designed to accomplish.
The two things you say now. One is, that's the long range, the non-separation of the school system education from the rest of society. So you say that has to do with also what is it that person does after he finishes school. What is the nature of the work, of course. So work and school, the relationship of the two. Another aspect you touch on, much like A.S. Neal does in Summerhill, the aspect of play.
Yes. I think it would be very desirable to remember that learning has an element of play, the mastery of gratuitous difficulties which don't necessarily have any utilitarian content at all. That would be useful.
It's the exact opposite, of course, of a technocratic approach.
Yeah.
The exact opposite. What are you doing wasting that kid's time for with that? He's not. He's delighting in what she is doing, and that in itself gives that kid an insight in something he or she might not have had, were it not for that playing.
Yeah. At almost every level of the educational system, what seems to have been forgotten is that the only way that people ever develop any capacities, intellectual or otherwise, is through using them and gaining confidence that they can use them. And that's true of teachers. It's also true of the people they're trying to teach. I think that there's a kind of compromise that now prevails in a great many classrooms where it's tacitly understood that the teacher will not make any very strict demands on the students, in return for which the students will leave the teacher alone. Sort of hassle-free environment.
In fact, going back to the beginning, the tightness that set in after Sputnik and the Soviets, and now with the commercial battle with resurgent Japan and Germany, even there it's cockeyed. Because language, you point out that foreign language is sort of optional, a year or two of it.
Yes, that struck me when I actually read the report of the National Commission on Excellence. For a long time I had only read reports of it in the papers. The rhetoric, about how unilateral educational disarmament, very tough rhetoric. And then if you look at their proposals, they're insignificant, particularly on the subject of foreign language. The nations with which we're competing and supposed to be falling behind and the most obvious point that you could make about their educational system is that training in foreign language begins very early in grade school. Children are exposed to several languages, a lot of it, and they actually learn how to use these languages. And this commission recommends, doesn't even suggest this ought to be a requirement, 2 years of foreign language in high school.
Even in their battle, a wrong battle as far as education, a commercial battle, even there they're wrong.
Yes, that's right.
But this is an experience I have often on this program when I have a foreign guest, who speaks English somewhat haltingly at times, but the foreign guest happens to be either Chinese or perhaps French or Italian or someone from one of the third worlds. And the person apologized to me for not speaking English too well. I said, You speak beautifully. I says, do you realize you're apologizing to me and I don't understand a word of your language? Yeah. So you think, this is, again, the arrogance we have, the arrogance of our own illiteracy.
Yes. Yeah.
And so the person who speaks the language, that is English, the American language,
right,
who speaks that language, is apologizing for not speaking as well as he should. But I say nothing about not knowing a word of whatever language he speaks.
Yeah,
that's what we're talking about too. So where does this leave us now, Christopher? As we say in soap operas, full name use. Where do you say now, Mother Worth or Christopher Lasch? Where does it leave us now, with minimal self and psychic survival in these troubled times?
Well, with regard to education, I would hope that at the very least it would leave us with a certain skepticism about all of these official recommendations we've been hearing, and also with a sense of the kind of pointlessness of the whole debate about education as it's been conducted for the last year or so, which tends to revolve around pretty trivial issues. It's endless controversy over school prayers, for example, as if that were the most important and pressing issue before the country.
The imposition of trivia upon our thoughts. You were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say that I think I can understand, once again, why people are dreadfully disappointed and rightly disappointed in the schools. And I guess I can understand why they somehow expect the schools to restore morality, but I do think it's an awfully misguided idea of how you go about restoring morality.
Yeah, I think you point out that morality itself comes about in education in the various forms that we don't follow today.
Yes.
That what is a moral person?
Yes.
Because it's someone connected to the community, too. See, they're talking about something in a vacuum. We haven't touched on that word, have we? Community.
A moral person in the classical sense, the tradition that I think has now been lost meant a person who was capable of acting responsibly as a member of some larger group, making a contribution to it, capable of exercising the kind of judgment that is required in any form of group life, none of which seems to have anything to do with the kind of morality that's being advocated.
Brings back to town hall meeting again, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, a good way to end this, Jose Iglesias, the writer who's of Spanish ancestry, speaking about his parents and his uncles and aunts in Tampa, in Ybor City, a Spanish-speaking suburb of Tampa during the 30s. And they were cigar makers. And they were hungry for knowledge. Here's the thing. They wanted to be educated. As they rolled their cigars, they had an actor, Italian-speaking actor in one case, a Spanish-speaking actor in the other, whom each of the workers paid 50 cents a week to as his fee. They had a platform, and he would read to them while they rolled the cigars. And the owners of the factories destroyed the platform, so it didn't cost them a cent, because they recognized these people would be educated. You know,
Yes.
and dangerous. So you'll hear his voice.
In the 1880s, Tampa tried to woo new industry there, and the cigar factories in Key West, which were Spanish-owned, Cuban-owned too, had been having a lot of trouble. That is, there were a great many strikes. So the owners of those factories in Key West were looking for an area which had that same kind of hot dampness, which is good for cigar making, and where they would have no labor trouble. So they were wooed by Tampa. Mr. Ybor was, for $5,000, given an enormous tract of land. He was to woo other cigar manufacturers, both from Key West and New York, and begin this industry down there. The miscalculation, however, was, of course, that they had to import their workers. And cigar makers are a kind of elite, in a sense, amongst workers in Latin America, and they simply had to import them either from Key West or Havana, and some from New York. They were also the most class-conscious workers you could find, so that, within 2 months of the factories beginning, there were already strikes. It grew, nevertheless. The industry grew enormously, and when I was a boy, there were 40,000 people living in Ybor City, all Spanish-speaking. I didn't learn the English until I had to when I started public school. It had its own newspapers. They had their own social and medical clubs, so that they built really the first good hospitals in Tampa. There was also an Italian club, because many Italians also came to the cigar industry in Tampa. They were always in the minority. And then there's a Cuban club. They did have, if you consider the mean wage in the United States, good wages for cigar makers. They were all bitterly fought for. They never had union recognition until almost the war, the Second World War. They had many, many strikes. As a matter of fact, people date their lives by various strikes in Tampa. There were, let's say 4. One in 1901, one in 1910, one in 1921, and then the famous Depression strike of 1931, which revolved around the readers in the factory. And that brings us to something that's very unusual in the life of cigar makers, and which is why they are a kind of elite amongst workers. The workers themselves used to pay, like 25 to 50 cents the most a week, and would hire a man to read to them during work. A little platform would be built in the factory. It's a cigar factory is usually one enormous open area with tables at which workers make cigars. So a platform would be erected that's above, so that he would be looking down on the cigar makers, and he would read to them some 4 hours a day. He would read from newspapers, magazines, and then there would be a book which was being read, a kind of serial in a sense, because it couldn't be read all in one day. What book would be read would be very democratically decided. The workers themselves would vote for what book they wanted to hear read as each one got finished. There was a certain amount of competition from factory to factory to get the best men, because some of them were marvelous natural actors. They would not just read a book, they would act out the scenes. And consequently, many cigar makers who were illiterate, knew the novels of Zola and Dickens and Pérez Galdós and Tolstoy. And the manufacturers decided that they would put an end to this, though this did not cost them a penny. And so they arrived one morning to find that the lecture platforms had been torn down, and so everyone went on strike. The strike became not only to get the readers back, but also it got allied with other demands, such as having soup kitchens in the grammar schools for the kids of poor families. In one grammar school, there was a soup kitchen finally established. The strike was lost. Every strike in my hometown was always lost, but they were bitterly fought for. In conversations, people would, referring to someone, they'd say, well, you know her. It was her grandfather who broke the strike in 1910. Or, it's no surprise that he's trying to break this strike since his mother broke the one in 1921. That kind of thing. One of my memories is during that strike, not on our block, but around the corner, about a half block away, a group of women at lunchtime waiting for the woman who lived there to come out because they were going to beat her up since she was breaking the strike. It's always been, later on when you come north and you read about labor matters from what we Ybor Citians would call the American point of view, it has always seemed very pious kind of nonsense, to hear about orderly strikes in which people picket in an orderly fashion, all of that, because in my hometown they were passionate affairs of life and death, and, nobody considered it outrageous that you should make the life of a strikebreaker totally miserable, and that it was a stigma never to be forgotten.
The strike was lost. The
Yes.
readers ever come back?
They have never come back. They have never come back, and of course the cigar industry after the Depression never again reached its peak again. It is a luxury industry. The Tampa cigars were all Havana cigars, handmade, a real luxury industry. It never really got back on its feet, and certainly after the embargo on Cuban tobacco, it's just nothing. The difference is enormous. People working in the cigar industry no longer have the intellectual horizons that my parents had, and my aunts and uncles, all of them. They were an extraordinarily cultivated people. Impinging around you is the culture of the United States. We were considered inferior. As a matter of fact, when an American got mad with any Latin from Ybor City, he was called a Cuban nigger. And eventually, and this was one of the first things I remember feeling, you get to want to be an American. You become ashamed that you come from this ghetto and this community. Oh, it's a terrible thing to try to get over.
Were they girl cigar makers?
Oh, of course. Women were in the factories. Oh, yes. And one of the people in the top strike committee was a woman, and she was the only woman in Tampa being of Mexican descent. And she was married to a shoe repairman who, about 6 blocks from where I lived. And they had several children, and one daughter and a son who were in junior high school where I was, not in my classes. And I still remember that day that I stood patrol, because the workers might advance in the junior high school, that she was kept in the principal's office, this daughter, and her mother went to jail as one of the top strike leaders. And I remember that everybody used to then take their shoes to be repaired to her husband. So she came out of Radford and they moved out of Tampa.
When did you sense they no longer felt it?
When the reader strike was lost and those people went to jail, and when they published in the Tampa paper, just a full page in large type, the names of all the members of the strike committees at every factory, none of whom got their jobs back. My mother did. Got her job back. Then there's another thing would happen. Then, you see, there'd be a blacklist, and they'd be strong about it for a while. But then you have foremen like my uncle. He didn't go by any blacklist. That's what there would be in that town. There would be enormous solidarity. There was it's something very nice. It was just something very nice.
What finally happened
By 1939, not later than that, at the beginning of the war, there was union recognition, AFL, strictly bread and butter union. Everybody says, some union. Now we have closed shop now. It doesn't matter,
Right.
And there was, it's a big joke. There was literally no Saturday at any cigar factory at which collections weren't being done to help somebody. Or, for example, when the Havana cigar makers would go on strike, a matter of honor, you sent money to them.
Was that key change in attitudes of people toward one another in the 30s to...
Yeah, even just physically, Tampa has become a place with a highway through it, a freeway through it. Nobody walks. There are no gathering places. You don't walk down 7th Avenue or East Broadway, as they would call it, too. And chat and talk and go to the clubs. No, you get in a car and you go somewhere. Everybody lives apart. Everybody has jobs. Their concerns are mundane ones. Getting a color TV set this year, that's the big thing. Getting a better job. But the whole atmosphere there, which was really a class-conscious working class one, is gone. Their whole life around the social clubs, the plays that they would put on, there were people there who were really such good amateurs that they could put on rather good shows. I remember going to see Zarzuelas, all of it. They would also bring to Tampa the great actors, Caruso came to Tampa to sing, not to the Americans, but to the Latins. They paid for that kind of thing. The romerias of the different clubs, there was an enormous social life around all of those clubs. There were all kinds of, collective activities. Cultural life, then plus the union, all of that. All these things that bound people together are shot.
So I suppose it's hard to talk about education without talking about the social arrangement.
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think that hunger for education is not dead. It's just that it has become increasingly incomprehensible to the people, because this hunger for knowledge really fit in very well with our current social arrangements.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to The Minimal Self, published by Norton. Minimal Self, and that psychic survival in troubled times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Studs.